Whenever you're trying to adapt a text, vocal, or written based format, be it a book, like an urban legend or myth, a comic, a manga, there's always a lot of complexities and compromises that you have to use. When you're trying to adapt it into, I guess you could say, a motion based format, be that a live action movie, a live action TV show, a cartoon, or an anime. And I would say, generally speaking, as with any other form of translation, there's two major approaches you can take. The first one is you try to do it as literally as possible. That is, you try to do it exactly if it's written, how the book describes it. Everyone has to fit the descriptions. If it's a manga or a comic, you might basically make it like one of those, when you had the flip books as kids, where it looked like the character was running because you were just flipping through pre-existing images, trying to make it like that, including absolutely everything that you can, even if it doesn't necessarily work with the flow. And that's kind of the first way of dealing with it. And I find in a lot of cases, fans really like that because they have their favorite part of the book or their favorite part of the story, and they're really excited to see the adaptation. And if something gets left out, it really irritates them. Now, the other approach is to make it more loose in terms of direct emulation. The focus is still to tell the core story with kind of the major details, but what's kind of considered more important than exactly replicating what happened is to try to convey the themes, the message, the characters, the emotions of the original, albeit they might make some adaptive changes. I think an example of something that balances these two pretty well would be the Watchmen movie, because while in my opinion it's very similar to the comic book, I think it actually does fix some of the problems with it. I like that they gave the Watchmen superpowers, or at least made them stronger than normal humans. And I like that they made the Watchmen an actual criminal team, because in the original they didn't actually function as a team, and it kind of made the whole premise difficult. So I think that Zack Snyder did a really good job of taking the source material and making some changes to make it kind of more representative of maybe what Alan Moore was trying to get at. And there are certainly cases where I think the adaptation is better than the original because it fixes some of the glaring issues with the original. And some things just don't translate very well to a more motion-based medium. Another, I think, good example of something that's a bit more adaptive would be Blade Runner versus Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep. Now, I've read the book Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep, and I've seen the movie multiple times. They are very different, but the basics are the same. You still have a main character named Deckard, who's a Blade Runner who hunts replicants. The core exploration as to what is a human, what is real, kind of the basic psychological, philosophical questions that are raised in the movie are also present in the book. The book is very silly, though, and very goofy, and it's not really a thriller. It's that strange Philip K. Dickish mixture of, like, pulp with LSD with interesting science fiction ideas. So they kept a lot of the bones, what made the book interesting, but at the same time they kind of gutted it and made it into more of a thriller, made it more existentialist, made it more serious and more kind of action-based. Because like most of the major shootouts and stuff that happen in the movie don't happen in the book, and just the pacing would be kind of a mess if you were to do it in movie form. I also feel like a lot of stuff from the 19th century just has a lot of minutia, a lot of like daily life stuff, a lot of unnecessary details which work in book form. But if you were to insert all of it into a movie, the movie would basically be entirely exposition and would be like 5 hours long. Now, as to where I sit, I'm somewhere on the fence between the two. I lean more in the trying to adapt it and make it into a more coherent narrative that better tries to encapsulate the themes or characters or message of the original in a format that's maybe better for the medium you're transitioning it to. My issue with that, though, is in a lot of cases people use that as an excuse to completely butcher the original work. I've been extremely critical of the Castlevania anime in the past, not only because it's not even my issue with it isn't because it didn't follow the plot of the games, because the games are kind of a mess. It's spread out over a long period of time. There's not a ton of detail, but they completely like changed the theme and the message and the characters. And they basically turned it from something where Christianity was portrayed quite favorably into like this fedora spinning, Dracula's a man of science, the church killed people who grew herbs. Like just really political, not even attempting to adapt any aspect of the original. Thematically or whatever, and this is an issue a lot of people have with, I guess you could say, woke media, where it's an adaptation, but it's an adaptation that's based on the premise of shitting on the original rather than trying to maybe update it a bit, put a different spin on it, make it a bit more original, make it a bit better to the specific medium. So at long last, this brings us to a category where people say certain things are unadaptable. They're impossible to adapt. You can't make a good adaptation. The two ones I most frequently hear this applied to are Berserk and Dune. But I think you could say the same for anything that's kind of like that, that's somewhat stream of consciousness, that has a lot of internal dialogue, that has a lot of kind of esoteric stuff going in the background that's kind of hard to convey, maybe in a visual format where you don't have more time to kind of go into detail about stuff. One of the big problems with Dune is just there's so much world building in the book, which is one of the reasons I like it so much, but it's hard to get that all done in the movie without it just being like 3 hours of exposition. And when you get into some of the cuts of the David Lynch Dune film, I find a lot of them it's based on how much extra exposition they put in, where they explain the planets, or they explain the Imperium, or they explain the war beforehand. That is a difficulty in adaptation. How things work in the Duneverse is a bit different than a lot of more generic sci-fi settings. So in a lot of movies, like you go into it and people have some idea what to expect. This is generic. You're 2300. These certain things are going to exist. The social structure is going to be this way. Oh, this is a dystopia. Oh, this is a utopia. Oh, this is a science gone bad thing. But Dune, that's kind of difficult just because it is very different in the way it's structured, the way the lore works, etc. And once again, those are all benefits of it, but it does make adaptation a bit difficult. So when people go to adapt Dune, it's very much into a case of, do you want to make it more plot driven and accurate to the book? Or do you want to make it more adaptational and try to take some of the esoteric concepts in the book and implement them into the adaptation? And I think in the case of Dune, it's interesting because we have two very clear examples of each, or one example of each, but two examples overall. So the first is we have the sci-fi mini-series of Dune. Now, I think this, I haven't seen too much. I don't think people regard this particularly highly. I think the biggest issue is probably just its budget and the fact that it was a mini-series instead of a movie. But I feel that was a much more faithful adaptation in terms of what actually happened. There was significantly less of like the weird shit, the disturbing imagery, the some big changes from the book that you had in David Lynch's Dune. But at the same time, I think it was a much less ambitious production thematically. And it was kind of more focused on, I guess, kind of the character of Paul, the politics, the hero's journey, that kind of thing. Whereas I think David Lynch's Dune tried to kind of hit broader and was more kind of existentialist. So that's the one side to the adaptation. Because I have seen people who will say, I can't follow the David Lynch one. I think it's interesting, but I have no idea what the hell's going on. Whereas the response for the Sci-Fi Channel one is, it's boring, but I can follow it. Which is tends to be how it is, and that's kind of the issue where Do you adapt it as more of a generic well, not generic, but more of a, just kind of a traditional storytelling format? Or do you make it more weird and existentialist? Because if you look at the Dune books, the ones that Frank Herbert wrote are all just bizarre. There's all this strange stuff in it. God Emperor is a bizarre book structurally, just what happens in it. Chapter House and Heretics are also bizarre. They're all kind of very strange, break the mold type things. Whereas his son tends to be a lot more of a traditional sci-fi writer. And I like both approaches personally, which most people don't like his son's work, but I'm just happy to have more content that expands the universe. But that's kind of the trade-off. And then you have David Lynch's Dune. Now, David Lynch's Dune is one of the weirdest movies ever made, at least the weirdest movies that actually had a budget. And it's very much an attempt to adapt the themes, message, and that sort of thing of Dune. And they take a lot of creative liberties because a lot of, like I said, what is in Dune is very subtle, is very psychological, is very much esoteric. So some examples. In the book Dune, Paul teaches the weirding way, which is the Bene Gesserit style of combat, to the Fremen to make them even more powerful. And in the movie, it's very hard to show that. So they give them the sonic cannons, where if you use the voice, which is what Bene Gesserit used to control people, it's amplified by this machine and it shatters rocks and stuff like that. And I think that was done because it's hard to show this kind of subtle combat prowess. When it comes to the Sardaukar, my understanding is in David Lynch's Dune, they're like a human subspecies or a special type of human that comes from a planet with poison gas, and that makes them kind of superhuman in terms of their powers. Now, in the book, they come from Seleucus Secundus, the prison planet, and the result of natural selection among the toughest, worst criminals in the galaxy. That's hard to show without a bunch of exposition, so he just decided to do that. All the weird shit we see on the Harkonnen planet with the heart plugs. I forget if the cat was in the book or not, but it's just to give you an idea of how depraved and how insane they are without having to go into too much additional exposition. And it is a very visually interesting movie. Maybe kind of some other things is Paul makes it rain at the end, which he doesn't do in the book. And with a few exceptions, the supernatural in Dune is kind of ambiguous. I think it's generally safe to say the supernatural probably does exist in at least the Frank Herbert Dune verse. It's just very subtle and in the background. And there's always some weird pseudo-scientific explanation, but that might just be a cope by the atheist characters. But Paul can't make it rain. It's not possible. But within the context of Paul being the messianic figure, of him fulfilling his character arc, of becoming the Kwisatz Haderach, of becoming emperor, it makes sense within the thematic context. And it is a great scene. Maybe another example would be making the emperor a lot older to try to show that he's afraid of losing his grip on power. The whole issue with him not having a male heir and not being sure about the future. That kind of being inserted. There's a lot of things like that in David Lynch's Dune where they're just purely adaptational to try to convey it. And I think for the most part it works, but it's just very bizarre. It's a delightfully bizarre movie. I've heard people say it's the best movie of all time and the worst movie of all time, jointly. So we'll see. I haven't watched the new one yet. I'm going to go watch it later today. If you're watching this video and you're wondering why I hadn't commented on it yet. But it'll be interesting to see how they try to deal with this. If they're going to try to go adaptational, if they're trying to go literal, or if they're going to try to kind of find that happy medium. And ideally, obviously, you want to do both, but you often can't do both. You have to make these compromises. I think another really good example of that is when you're doing historical fiction. something like the death of Stalin, for instance, do you adapt things as exact as possible, or do you add stuff in and move stuff around to try to give kind of a better context thematically and in terms of the characters, even if they might not necessarily have done something, or a scene may not have happened historically, it kind of represents something else that happened or that was going on behind the scenes, or the dynamic. So those are my thoughts on the issues with adapting Dune and adapting what did I say, written works in general. So I hope you enjoyed the review. There will be a review of Dune up soon. God bless.